Lesson 22. Nehemiah, man of faith and action. Let us rise up and build. Reading Nehemiah 1, 2, 3, 4 and 6. Objective: to show how a man of prayer, faith and action encouraged the returned Jews to rise up and build. We will learn important lessons which can help us to overcome our own problems. Background: after the first return under Joshua and Zerubbabel, there was a further restoration under Ezra the scribe. 12 years later, Nehemiah returned to Jerusalem as governor of the province. The inhabitants were disorganized and despondent. Bad news from Judah. Nehemiah held the honored position of cupbearer to Artaxerxes, king of Persia. Hanani, his brother, and others had just come back from Judah, and Nehemiah asked them concerning the newly established nation in verse 2. Notice that this was the first question he put to his brother, for though he worked in Shushan the palace, his heart was in Jerusalem. He was greatly concerned for his people at Jerusalem, and became more so when he received the report, "The remnant are in great affliction and reproach. The wall of Jerusalem also is broken down, and the gates thereof are burned with fire." Verse 3. When he heard these words, he sat down and wept, and mourned for several days, fasting and praying to Yahweh. Nehemiah's prayer. Nehemiah 1 verses 1 to 11. After several days of mourning and fasting, Nehemiah was prepared to approach Yahweh and pray for the restoration of Jerusalem and her people. As a model prayer, Nehemiah spoke of Yahweh's covenant with the faithful and an admission of the sins of himself and the nation. He appealed to Yahweh to remember his covenant with his people and the promise that Zion was the chosen place for his glory. In conclusion, Nehemiah pleaded for Yahweh to hear his prayer and that of the other faithful servants who desire to fear thy name, in verse 11. He sought God to be with him as he came before Artaxerxes as his cupbearer. The prayer is answered. Nehemiah 2 verses 1 to 8. 4 months had passed since Nehemiah had received the distressing news from Hanani, and again it was his duty to act as the cupbearer. When he stood before the king, he was downcast and preoccupied. Noticing the unusual change in his countenance, the king asked, "Why is thy countenance sad, seeing thou art not sick?" "This is nothing else but sorrow of heart." Verse 2. Nehemiah now became fearful and replied that the cause of his sorrow was the desolation and destruction of his beloved city, Jerusalem. Suddenly a wonderful opportunity was opened to him when the king replied, "For what dost thou make request?" Immediately Nehemiah acknowledged Yahweh by giving a short, silent prayer. See Proverbs 3 verse 6. He prayed that Yahweh would be with him in his petition. Nehemiah asked the king to let him go to rebuild Jerusalem. The king granted his request to go and to later return to Persia, in verse 6. Nehemiah requested letters of protection and authorization to obtain timber from the king's forest, in verses 7 and 8. As a man of prayer and action, Nehemiah acknowledged that the king granted me according to the good hand of my God upon me, in verse 8. With that reassurance, Nehemiah determined to help his brethren in Jerusalem. As Paul wrote later, "If God be for us, who can be against us?" See Romans 8, verse 31. Nehemiah arrives at Jerusalem. Nehemiah 2 verses 9 to 18. Protected and fortified by a Persian escort, Nehemiah soon was on his long journey to his beloved city. Following his arrival, he presented his credentials to the surrounding rulers, but was received with resentment by the enemies of the Jews. He realized their hatred and impending opposition. The temple had been built, but there were no walls, and the Jews living in the city were open to hostile treatment from their enemies. Nehemiah waited 3 days. Then, one night, with a few trusty companions, he reviewed the state of the walls of Jerusalem. He loved the city, where the history of the past had been enacted, but the wall was in ruins, and its gates blackened with fire. Areas were cluttered up with huge masses of broken masonry, so that the beast on which he rode could not make its way. He then returned to the Jews, but said nothing about his tour of inspection. A few days later he gathered the rulers. He carefully outlined to them the sorry state of the Jews and the city. "Ye see the distresses that we are in, the disgrace this brought them in the sight of the Gentiles round about," in verse 17, his outline of the good hand of God upon the king of Persia. When he finished his words, they all enthusiastically exclaimed, "Let us rise up and build," in verse 18. His own enthusiasm had become contagious. The challenge from the adversaries. Nehemiah 2 verse 19 to 20. The enthusiasm of Nehemiah had inspired the people with a zeal to work, but had produced an unfavourable reaction from their enemies. It was not long before they came to the site and laughed the workers to scorn, suggesting also that the workers were planning to rebel against the king. Chapter 2 verse 19. However, Nehemiah, a truly great leader, was able to meet this challenge with a bold statement of the truth, which silenced his enemies and encouraged his brethren. "The God of heaven, he will prosper us. Therefore we, his servants, will rise and build. But ye have no portion, nor right, nor memorial in Jerusalem," in verse 20. Principle for living, faith and action. Our Father wants us to put complete trust in him and ask him in prayer to help us. Living the truth is important, and so faith must be put into action. Nehemiah not only prayed, but he lived his faith by acting on what he knew to be right. We cannot pray for Yahweh to be with us and then do nothing. We must be doers and not hearers only. Paul put it this way, "For we are labourers together with God." 1 Corinthians 3 verse 9. We trust in God and move forward in faith. Rebuilding commenced, followed by more opposition. Nehemiah 3 and 4. Words became actions as Nehemiah organized all the people into the work of rebuilding the walls. Family groups worked together, as did all classes: priests, Levites, labourers, tradesmen, perfume mixers, rulers, women and merchants. Many laboured in sections where they had a particular interest. The surrounding people viewed the rebuilding of the walls of Jerusalem with the greatest concern. Their leader was Sanballat, who had with him the army of Samaria. Chapter 4 verse 2. He and Tobiah the Amorite stirred them up by saying, "Even that which ye build, if a fox go up, he will even break down their stone wall." Verse 3. On hearing of their ridicule, Nehemiah sought God's help through prayer. He asked that Yahweh would curse them and not forgive their sin, as they had brought dishonour upon his people. So the people were encouraged and had a mind to work. Verse 6. And they completed the wall around the city, to half its original height. Now their enemies were furious, and conspired all of them together to come and fight against Jerusalem and to hinder it. Chapter 4, verse 8. Again Nehemiah turned to God in prayer, and then set up watchmen upon the walls both day and night. But now troubles came from their midst. Some of the men of Judah became discouraged, tired out and afraid, and so were not able to build the wall. Complaining, like enthusiasm, is infectious. Rumors started to circulate of a threatened attack. Then Nehemiah saw the forces of Sanballat around the city and about to attack. He exhorted the people to remember Yahweh and to fight for their families and homes. At this show of defiance, the enemies withdrew because God had brought their counsel to naught. Verse 15. And so the people returned to their work on the walls. Nehemiah then made an arrangement that half of those who had come with him from Persia stand guard, while the other half continued with the work of rebuilding the walls. In addition, every Jewish worker was to keep his weapon close by, so that at the sound of the trumpet he would put down his tools, pick up his weapons, and assemble at the point of attack. Nehemiah himself became the principal watchman upon the walls of the city, and with him was a trumpeter to raise the alarm. He also instructed the people that they were to lodge within Jerusalem, and not return to their individual villages as they had previously done. Nehemiah was a wonderful example of devotion to duty. He and those with him never relaxed, only changing their clothes when they washed. They even took their weapons with them when they went to obtain their daily water needs. In verse 23, they were always found at their post, always labouring on the wall or standing guard in its defence. 3 attempts by the adversaries fail. Nehemiah 6. The adversaries had failed to stop the building of the wall, so they turned to other more cunning and devious methods. They knew Nehemiah was a brilliant leader who could discourage and strengthen the workers, and therefore they planned to destroy him. They asked him to meet them, but he quickly realized their objective. He replied with an answer for any who would interfere with the work of God. I am doing a great work, so that I cannot come down. Why should the work cease while I leave it and come down to you? Chapter 6, verse 3. They asked him 4 times. On each occasion he gave them the same answer. See chapter 6 and verse 4. Sanballat's final plea came in the form of an open letter saying it was commonly reported that the wall was being built for the purposes of rebellion, and that Nehemiah was intending to appoint himself as king. Again Nehemiah realized that this was a scheme to destroy him, and replied, There are no such things done as thou sayest, but thou feignest, or invented, them out of thine own heart. In verse 8. Finally, they schemed to destroy his reputation by showing everyone that he was fearful and afraid. They told Shemaiah to meet Nehemiah in the temple with the doors locked, saying that his enemies were going to kill him that night. But his trust in Yahweh had always encouraged the people, and therefore it was necessary that on this occasion he did not give in and break God's law. So he replied, Should such a man as I flee, I will not go in. Verse 11. The wall was finally completed. Nehemiah 6, verses 15 and 16. Despite all hindrances, difficulties, attacks, threats, treachery and opposition, the wall was completed in the incredibly short time of 52 days. Sanballat and his allies had been defeated at every turn. The enemies of Judah looked upon the completed walls of Jerusalem with a feeling of utter depression. They could only acknowledge that Yahweh, God of Nehemiah, achieved the work. Truly Nehemiah could reflect upon the words of Psalms 34 verse 19. Many are the afflictions of the righteous, but Yahweh delivereth him out of them all. Summary. Nehemiah had a great love for Jerusalem and an earnest desire to return to Judah. So Yahweh graciously answered his prayer in Shushan the palace. As a great leader, he did not give up in the face of problems, but continually sought Yahweh's help in time of need, as well as working with the people. He was a man of prayer and action. His faith was manifested by his works. We must do the same today in our lives, for by our works of faith we shall be judged. Enthusiasm and pessimism are both very contagious. We can inspire others in the Master's service only if we are keen and dedicated ourselves. We, like Nehemiah, should be able to quickly perceive the deceit and opposition of those around us and seek Yahweh's assistance and protection whilst continuing to work in harmony with His will.